Welcome to The Pick List, the podcast for curious food industry minds.
Every week, we bring you our pick of articles from the world of food and grocery retail and explore what they tell us about how our food industry is changing in these extraordinary times.
We chat about the major news from nationals and big trade titles, but we also love unearthing gems from niche publications and sharing brilliant, quirky food stories that change the way we think about the food we eat and produce.
I'm Julia Glotz.
And I'm Laura Ryan.
It's great to have you with us. Let's start the show.
Hi Julia, it's 2021 and we are super excited to be back with the pick list. It is the beginning of season 3, episode 29, and we've got a brilliant series ahead of us, haven't we?
Absolutely. Lots of very exciting guests lined up. And we should also say we've just added a new option to thepicklist.co.uk where you can now put yourself forward as a potential guest for one of our future episodes. So if you've ever fancied being on the show with us, why don't you visit thepicklist.co.uk and let us know that you'd like to be a guest.
We've also heard from loads of our listeners over the break and they've been telling us their feedback on the pick list, which has been brilliant. So please do rate and review the pick list if you haven't already. Today we've got a brilliant guest. Tell us who we've got, Julia.
We're joined today by Donal Denvir, who is General Manager for Great Britain at Bord Bia. Donal has quite a wide range of experience in the food and drink sector. I also discovered he lived in Germany for 10 years, so he brings a real international perspective to our discussion. Of course, given the Irish perspective as well in his role at Bord Bia, we did talk about the B word quite a lot. We talked extensively about Brexit and the impact on trade, as you might expect, and it's been fascinating to get Donal's perspective on that.
I was very lucky the episode wasn't recorded in German because my GCSE German definitely wasn't going to carry me through. And today's episode is sponsored, isn't it?
It is. It's sponsored by Shopper Intelligence. Shopper Intelligence is an industry database that puts the voice of shoppers back into category management with survey-driven metrics you don't get from other sources, comparing across all supermarket fresh food and consumer goods categories.
For more information, just go to shopperintelligence.com and we'll put the link in the show notes too. Shall we start the show?
Donal, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. Great to be here.
Could you briefly introduce yourself and tell our listeners how you're connected to food and drink?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Donal Denvir. I am the manager of Bord Bia's London office. For people who don't know what Bord Bia is, it is the Irish Food Board, and we're responsible for promoting Irish food and drink globally. And I guess my remit, obviously, is the UK. So what's my connection to food and drink? Well, I was thinking about this the other day. I've been working in the food and drink industry for over 10 years now, which is a little bit scary. I've been in this job for about a year and a half as the manager of Bord Bia's London office. Prior to that, I managed Bord Bia's Germany office based in Dusseldorf, Julia, which I believe you know quite well.
I do indeed.
So that was for about 4.5 years. And actually prior to that, then I was based out in Thailand working for Synergy Flavors, which is headquartered actually in High Wycombe, not too far from here, from London. And that is a subsidiary of Carberry Group, which is an Irish dairy company. So kind of all in all, my connection to the food industry is a relatively strong and frighteningly long one at this point of my career.
Fantastic. And I think that breadth of experience is really reflected in some of the articles that you've chosen for us as well. Before we jump into your articles and quiz you on those, we're still in January. I think we're still to an extent in sort of forecasting season and thinking about what's ahead for 2021. Can you give us a really quick flavour of what the big focus for Bord Bia is going to be this year? Any trends or issues that you think will dominate this year?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the big news that we would have gotten was obviously in relation to Brexit on Christmas Eve. It was a nice little, I'm not sure if I call it a Christmas present because it was more of a relief than joy, I suppose. So I guess, since that, and we're probably going to get into it at some point, it's kind of almost hard to have a conversation without mentioning the B word at this point. Now that all of that certainty is there, we can actually start to plan a little bit more strategically for the UK market. and start to look at, well, what are the assets that we have. So, in terms of trends, like sustainability really is the one that is the big macro trend and the one that's not going away. So we'd like to think that we're pretty well positioned on that front in terms of the kind of systems that we've brought in. So what we'll be doing is seeing how can we look to help our Irish companies commercialize and use the sort of sustainability infrastructure that we've built up over the last, well, decade really, to match the kind of insights capabilities that we have as well. So how do we match consumer trends, the sustainability consumer trends that are out there, with a kind of commercial proposition for the Irish companies that we're dealing with in the UK? So yeah, sustainability is kind of one of those big macro ones. I guess COVID-19 has brought up a lot of trends, like, scratch cooking obviously was a big one. Health is another macro trend that has really just accelerated, I suppose, with COVID. And which of those trends will end up being sticky? Which ones will kind of turn into hybrid trends as people start to go back to the office, or sort of spend half their time in the office, half the time at home? And how will that all develop? So our main focus is really like looking at those trends and seeing how our companies can benefit from them.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of articles that I think will speak to some of the trends that you picked out there. We'll be talking about plastic a little later on, and also, of course, that whole sort of scratch cooking piece and the ready meals market with one of the articles that you've picked as well. Another question that we were really keen to ask you is, the pick list is all about sort of finding interesting things to read and sharing interesting reads about the food and drink industry. Just give us a super quick sense of your own personal reading habits. How do you stay up to date on what's happening in the industry, and are there any particular publications that you read on a regular basis?
Well, the classic obviously is The Grocer. I think anyone who's
No
not
surprise there.
reading The Grocer shouldn't probably be in the industry. What I actually try and like to do is keep up to date with some of the publications from my previous roles. So, like when I was in Germany for the 4.5 years, I tried to keep up to date on the German language publications that I would have kept up to. So, in other words, I haven't unsubscribed from a lot of the kind of newsletters that I would have gotten, and it's just to see where they're at in terms of consumer trends. Now, I have to say, when it comes to food and drink, the UK generally is a couple of years ahead of Germany when it comes to kind of innovations, branded or private label innovations. But I still like to just keep an eye on what's going on, or even to track how long or what amount of time has passed between an innovation coming in here versus Germany. And then I also, bit of a nerd, kind of keep up on my flavor business newsletters from my second previous role, or two roles away in the past, from my role with Synergy Flavors in Thailand. So yeah, there's like Food Navigator, Food Ingredients, Grocer, IGD, Mintel, the Irish Times, which I think we'll probably get to. So yeah, long reading list. The FT, I think we're going to have on today as well. So I'd kind of read that as general interest as well, just to kind of keep on top of things.
Fantastic. Really nice broad selection of publications there. So now tell us about the first article that you've picked for us.
Well, I mentioned the B word there, so I suppose we'll get straight into it. So this one is from the Irish Times, which I read every day. And one of the bigger food stories that was in there this week was around consumers likely to face a 9% increase in the cost of bread. And this is to do with Brexit tariffs on flour imports, increasing the costs for the sector. So, like I said, it's somewhat unsurprising that I've chosen a Brexit-related topic, given my role. But essentially, what this article is highlighting is that the trade deal that I mentioned, that obviously came in on the 24th of December, this is having a particularly negative impact on the Irish bakery sector. So it's got to do with tariffs being applied to flour imports from GB to Ireland, because we don't actually produce any flour in Ireland, so we have to get it from GB. And this is the details around rules of origin. So, like, under the rules of origin piece within the trade deal, there is a requirement that the wheat that's used in the actual flour needs to be at least 85% from the UK or the EU. So that's actually stipulated. And that if there's wheat from other countries, like say Canada or the US, which obviously are big wheat producing countries, that if there is wheat in there, it has to be below the 15% threshold. Otherwise, there's a €172 tariff slapped onto the ton of flour essentially for the bakery producer. So it's obviously very difficult for the Irish bakery sector. They're actually looking for a special dispensation or derogation to mitigate against it. They've written to various bodies on that. And I guess this is just one of the issues really that's been on the agenda for a while, and now it's just really coming into much sharper focus as the actual practicalities of Brexit really start to hit home. I know one of the other rules of origin issues that has come up is around, like, essentially the UK has for a long time acted as a distribution base for products that are servicing the UK and Ireland as sort of one entity. But obviously the rules of origin piece of the trade deal states that, that there needs to be some sort of a significant added value to these products for them to qualify for that zero tariff piece. So in the previous setup, obviously there was, it demonstrated the kind of very interconnectedness, the interdependence of the UK and Irish supply chains and supply bases. And this is really one of the issues that is just highlighting the sort of difficulties that the post-Brexit reality has now brought on. So I guess, since I've been since 2021 had started, we've been dealing with a couple of Brexit related issues. They've been relatively low in quantity, I would say, from the Ireland to GB side. Like we'd like to think that this is down to our 4 years of preparation, that we put in a lot of hard work in terms of training, companies up on how to do all of the paperwork. But the big issue at the moment is really GB to Northern Ireland. That's the big hot topic at the moment on retailers' agendas, particularly, the kind of conversations we're having with them. For all intents and purposes, there's essentially like a border now in the Irish Sea with checks, etc. And these are obviously going to get, increase over the next couple of months. Coming into April is phase 2, coming into July is phase 3. So that's going to ramp up. So we're keeping an eye on that. We're staying close to retailers, understanding their issues, seeing what we can do in terms of information provision from our side. April is when the SPS checks, the health certs come in. That's more red tape. There are concerns around the infrastructure that's in place for those, and in particular, are there enough vets available to actually do these health certs, to put it kind of bluntly? Now, that's not something we're directly involved in, but it's something that we would be informing our clients about and keeping up to speed on. Obviously, there's a lot of news at the moment in Britain itself on the export side in terms of seafood is obviously the huge one. So we keep an eye on that type of thing if we're not directly related to us in terms of our own exports into the UK. But they're obviously looking for grace periods on bureaucracy. On the meat side, I think there are concerns, and I'm sure Laura would be familiar with these and well placed to comment. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. And as well, what's going to happen on UK agricultural policy? What types of supports are going to be in place to British farmers to replace the Common Agricultural Policy? So I promised myself I wouldn't talk too much about Brexit, but here we are talking about it.
There's so much to go at, isn't there? And I was really intrigued by our article because it's something that I wouldn't see. And it's great, Julia, asking the question about, what is it you read every week? And we're bombarded, aren't we, working in the food and drink industry with so many sources. So to see what the Irish Times are reporting here was really fascinating. What do you think, as looking at that as a standalone case study for now, what the endpoint's going to be? Do you think there would be a derogation, or do you think in some parts, and I guess it's the same for UK consumers, food is just going to get more expensive? We've had food at relatively low price. It's always banded around that, we've got the second lowest food prices in the world and people are going to have to get used to paying more. But that's not a great political platform to be on. Where do you think that'll go, Donal?
I don't know for this specific case what will happen. I think if we take a step back and look at it just more broadly, like what we're hearing from retailers is that there's just a reevaluation of the food supply chain and the structure of how food is produced, distributed, and processed in general. I think that the big elephant in the room of all of this is cost and price, like you've identified. we all know, and I'd say everybody, food industry professionals that that listen to this podcast are aware of the low margins in the food industry, and like, where are those extra costs going to go? There isn't a whole lot of wiggle room on either side, really, and it's not a case of who blinks first between customer and supplier. It's a case of, this is not economically viable to produce this product. Now, whether we're talking about bakery or anything else, ultimately, I think it's a combination, or will be a combination, crystal ball time, but like a combination of higher prices and resetting to a certain extent of food supply chains.
Yeah. And my second point is, you mentioned there the training that Bord Bia have done for the industry in Ireland, and I was absolutely overwhelmed by how much training you guys have been doing. And I was lucky enough to be over in Dublin 18 months ago and listening to the work that Bord Bia were doing at that time, even training lorry drivers on paperwork to make sure trade was going to be as frictionless as possible. Do you think, I know, notwithstanding the vet's point, which is very real, some of this is about, is there enough people there to deal with this paperwork, but is it some of it just a training exercise to make sure everyone knows what we should be doing? And once we're over all these hurdles, maybe this is me ever the optimist, once we're over all of this, then everyone will know how to fill out the form correctly and who needs to tick which boxes, and then it'll just be a whole lot easier.
Well, a lot of it is. I mean, a lot of the delays and like the so-called, like a lot of the complaints about red tape and the delays have been about, the amount of paperwork. But we've had 4 years to prepare for this paperwork. Everyone has had 4 years to prepare for this paperwork. There weren't any secrets about what a custom declaration is. Like, there was always going to have to be custom declarations made. We knew that from the beginning. So I take with a pinch of salt a complaint about having to fill out custom declarations and not being prepared about certain topics, because we've known that for a long time. Now, of course, in terms of systems and all of that, that's something that is either out of your control, or there's infrastructural upgrades that are required there. But yeah, a lot of it is, business does adapt. Like, people do find, I mean, look at us, we're sitting at home here doing a podcast virtually. We're working from home for the last almost year, and just look at all of the restaurants who've pivoted into online, and delivery, and are surviving through that. So, like, business adapts. I mean, generally quicker than government. It's kind of like trade finds a way. Like, trade flows do continue if there's a consumer demand and a supply for a product at a price a consumer was willing to pay and a producer is willing to produce. Like, trade will kind of find a way through that. So yeah, I think a lot of it is actually upskilling, like whether it's supply chain mapping, whether it's customs declarations, whether it's negotiation training to a certain extent, that you have to be very clear about increased costs with your customer. Like, these are the types of programs we've been running for years now, and I hope and think that that's why we've had relatively low amounts of queries from the Irish side. And I think, just listening to customers in the last couple of weeks, we've been quite proud and enthused by the fact that the kind of queries from Ireland at least have been fairly low.
Julia, what's your first pick this week?
So my first pick this week is from the Sunday Times, and it's an article titled "It Would Be Feast, Not Famine If We Learned to Love Our Own Food," and it's a piece written by Joanna Blythman. And in many ways, it continues some of the themes that we've already started talking about around Brexit and self-sufficiency and trade. By way of background, Joanna is a really well-known food journalist and author. Many of our listeners will be familiar with her work. She's also a grocer columnist. I used to work with her while I was at the grocer, and she's really an opinion editor's dream. A really great writer, and not shy about saying exactly what she thinks, which is exactly what you want from a columnist. This particular piece that she's written for the Sunday Times is to a large extent prompted by this ongoing debate that Donal's already referred to, that we're having about security of food supply, trade into and out of the UK post-Brexit, post-EU trade deal, and to an extent post-COVID as well. We are, of course, still continuing to see disruption to some trade, some sectors still experiencing real difficulty when it comes to exports, and others, of course, worrying about their ability to get certain produce into the country. So Joanna is wondering if a lot of this anxiety about trade disruption is in fact rooted in a lack of confidence, if you will, and knowledge of what we produce locally. Do we in the UK simply appreciate our homegrown produce less than is the case in other countries? Do we crave imported goods because we fundamentally don't know about the breadth and the quality of what is produced here? And so she wonders if there's an opportunity here to re-engage consumers with local British food, get us to eat more based on the seasons as opposed to expecting permanent global summertime, and also drive up self-sufficiency in the process. And crucially, I suppose, part of this argument is that if imports are less easily available in the future, perhaps some of the big buyers, such as the supermarkets, will have more of an incentive to look more carefully at what really needs to be imported and what could perhaps be produced closer to home. And I'm really interested in this idea, and partly because I can't quite make up my own mind about it, which is why I wanted to discuss it with you both on the show. And I think, Donal, you've got a really interesting perspective on this, given your experience of Germany, but also, of course, from an Irish perspective. And I just wonder what you make of this debate that's happening in the UK at the moment, where we're sort of starting to grapple with this sense of, is there perhaps an upside to having a little bit of that trade disruption? And are we really underappreciating the local produce and the local food that we grow here? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was interested and quite glad to see that the image on the website is that Ireland is actually included. Now, as one of the regions, even if we're not part of the UK, but we're actually included on the map. So if anyone is researching the article later on, they can see. And you know what, this is great because it just goes to show that, when it comes to food and drink, in consumers' minds, Ireland is considered local. And actually, we've got a fair bit of research and insights that actually confirm this fact. So Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, when we put them side by side and ask consumers about being open to choosing food and drink from those countries, we rank right up there, and there's a big drop off then afterwards. I think in the article it's mentioned there's a 55% self-sufficiency in the UK on food for 2019. Like, that is quite low. Ireland is 680% self-sufficient on food because we're just a huge net exporter, because we're obviously a very small country and produce a lot of food, particularly beef and dairy. I think, like with all of these trends, it's a bit of a hybrid. So I think we are obviously seeing an increase in the desire for people to shop local. But there's also an increase in people wanting choice and wanting premium. So I think they're probably mutually, you might say, conflicting, but they're kind of they happen side by side. So the consumer can shop local and then buy Wagyu beef, for example, or want to have a Wagyu beef from Japan imported, but then go down and buy local the next day. I think it's just a reflection of globalization. Food is a very emotional topic. It's a very emotive topic. So people talk far less about where their iPhone was produced or where their financial services product came from, or whatever software they're using. I don't know where Zoom was developed. We're on Zoom at the moment, but it's when it comes to food, because you kind of put it into your body. It's very emotional. It's kind of it's part of your survival. I think it gets a lot more attention in that sort of local space. So I think the fact is, like, it is 2021 and we do live in a global marketplace, and we are an interconnected world. Like, we've seen that more than ever during COVID because of obviously the rise of digital technology, etc. Another maybe final point I'd make on this is that the kind of direct to consumer trend has really, really taken off during COVID, whether it's farmers delivering directly to consumers or farmers markets delivering direct to consumers. And I think what that is more about is actually, it's more about human beings and trust, and it's more about transparency and knowing the farmer or the producer, and that the animal welfare standards are high, that the sustainability practices are high, rather than literally being 5 miles up the road. I think it's more about knowing that there's somebody behind it and a family behind it and a kind of a local, and that they're being taken care of. So I think that the trust element is higher than the local element, if that makes sense. But again, they're not totally mutually exclusive either.
You make some amazing points, Donal, and I think the local piece for Ireland, I think, is very valid. The data that I've seen, it would also back that up. And interestingly, some data that I saw that people in the UK thought that New Zealand, although obviously not local, but because of the points that you've flagged about sustainability, about green pasture and all the rest of it, for lamb, because it's been on our supermarket shelves for so long, is synonymous with quality and actually hasn't got a trading differential to British. So some of those hurdles are going to be huge to come over, or to overcome rather. And I guess the other point that I thought about was education, both as you mentioned there about connection with agriculture. It's not in a lot of our national curriculum anymore, i.e. connecting with farming, because it is such a small part of our GDP, and also cooking too. When and Joanna's article was brilliant. A lot of it you're thinking it's a lot primary product, and some of that you're going to have to be able to cook to be able to use it. And we've just, home economics has been on and off the national curriculum in the UK for so long that we probably have got swathes of generations that just can't cook that sort of product, so wouldn't know what to do with seasonal variations across the year. And the data that we see is you've got a meal repertoire of about 6 to 8 dishes that you just rotate every single week. Not right, well, rhubarb's in season, let's make a crumble. That's a huge change, and you've got to be embedding that into kids at the age of 8 upwards, I would have said. So not impossible, but yeah, it's very different. And maybe does it also fit in with this huge piece that we've heard about obesity over the last year as well? You know, government were very open, and the national food strategies talked about this a bit, about how we need to be a healthier nation. And is that linked to cooking education and the connection back to what we're growing, and we should be buying it and using it at home?
Laura, what's your first article for us?
My first article this week is from The Guardian, and it's got the headline, UK supermarkets not doing enough to cut plastic, says report. And this is a new report from Greenpeace and the Environmental Investigation Agency. And it's a report in their third year looking at plastics used by the retailers. And this data is referring to 2019. I was interested to see if it was referring to 2020, but not yet, because that's going to be really interesting about how we've used plastic. So bearing that in mind, the footprint is saying that this report is bigger than what they measured in 2017. And one of the major stats they're talking about is up 65% for plastic bags from 2017. And to put that in perspective, each household in the UK in 2019 is buying on average 57 bags for life in that year. So you're buying over one bag for life a week, which is just, because some of the numbers in this report is unsurprisingly all in billions, but when you break it down to the population. So the article calls out really that the whole reuse bags isn't working. We're just buying another one when we get there and not quite sure what we're doing when we get them all home. Maybe filling them with trainers under the stairs is what I tend to do, but everyone will have a version. In April of this year, non-reusable plastic bags will increase from 5 pence to 10 pence. So that hopefully to try and get folks to stop buying as many and start to reusing, but will that 5p lift make an impact? And then there was another stat that was pulled out in the article which I was really interested by and hadn't really thought about, but it was cutlery, plastic cutlery. That's actually had a rise from 2017 by 36%. And the article really pulls out that there's a static picture. The sector needs to urgently pick up the pace and to reduce the amount of plastic that we're using. And like all these reports, there's a league table, and retailers get very nervous when anything's in a league table. And just to pick a couple of, I don't want to say winners and losers, various players on the league table out. Waitrose is top of the league table. They've reduced their plastic by just over 6% since 2017. Iceland, and they've had a lot of coverage this week about rebutting some of the claims in this report, are now bottom of the list, and that's because not only they've reduced some plastic in their own brand products, but a lot of the FMCG products that they sell haven't been able to do that. Aldi have, in the report, have risen to second place, and that's because they've done two major things: been more transparent about the amount of plastic they're using, and also have stopped selling single-use plastic bags. Maybe that's why we're buying all reusable ones, I'm not quite sure. Morrison's have dropped to 9th place, and I was really interested by this because the article pulls out the fact that, again, that because they're selling so many plastic single-use bags, but we've seen a lot over Morrison's over the last 18 months about paper bags, so maybe that will come through into the 2020 data. So to summarise what it's saying is there's pressure on FMCGs to be more transparent. Unsurprisingly, the Coca-Colas of this world are saying they're doing a lot to reduce plastic usage, but what it does call out in the report that potentially even as close as next year, plastic usage is going to be in maybe some sort of financial type accounting. So it's in a format that is easily transferable and can read across different retailers and different suppliers into retail and be publicly available. So it's, as we know, and you've mentioned at the beginning of the show, Donal, sustainability is hugely important to consumers now more than ever. David Attenborough mentions it almost every single time he's on TV, and some of these figures will be start reading for the industry. And I guess will be really interesting to see when last year's data comes out. Actually, did plastic usage just even go through the roof even more as we battled the pandemic? What are your thoughts, Donal, on plastic usage, and what can the supply chain do? Because they're trying, but it seems that we're not trying hard enough at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, almost every conversation we have with retailers, plastic is called out as if, that and carbon emissions, like kind of 1 and 2 in terms of their sustainability agenda. It's really called out by all of the major customers, and they're concerned because it's a consumer concern. It's a regulatory concern, and it's obviously going to be an even bigger concern now that the US have signed back up to the Paris Climate Accord. So kind of, we have all of the major players like getting the finger out, I suppose, in relation to climate issues, sustainability issues. It's funny because COVID was a bit of a setback for plastic. There was a huge spike in plastic consumption because consumers wanted that safety. They didn't want to touch food in store, and they wanted to use plastic. That has reset again. That was kind of calmed down again, and it's sort of back to normal in a certain sense of customers and big retailers trying to reset that agenda and decrease their plastic consumption.
Donal, what's your second pick for us?
Okay, so my second article is actually not, it's kind of an article. It's a category report. And I read the summary article. So it's a category report in the grocery, which you just mentioned. Has COVID finished off ready meals and soups category report 2021? Essentially, the article asks, how ready meals can reassert their convenience and health credentials. So I have a couple of stats here that I might rattle through to kind of get the juices flowing on it. So in 2020, chilled ready meals were down 3.6%, according to Nielsen. And that's obviously in a year when grocery in total was up 8%. So quite significant stat there. At the very start of lockdown, so let's say almost this time last year, they were actually down 25%. Now, it's mainly in the area of chilled ready meals, because ambient actually for the whole year was up 10.1% and frozen was up 5.6%. But this was mainly due to panic buying and stockpiling, particularly at the beginning of the lockdowns. But the big figure really is the losses on chilled ready meals, and chilled ready meals actually account for about 3/4 of the overall category. So the big decline for them obviously had a big impact on the overall category. Interestingly, branded did well. So Charlie Bigham's is an example. They were up 20% in terms of unit sales for chilled ready meals, and they had a really, really strong performance because consumers essentially splashed out on premium. Chilled private label was down 5.1%, and this is actually 85% of the overall chilled market. So any decline here, even that 5% decline, was going to have a huge impact overall. So essentially, the big subcategory chilled was down mainly because of private label, but branded did well. So I think brands in general have done well out of the pandemic, and that's probably not a good thing to say, as nothing has, there's been no real good news out of the pandemic, but in terms of food and drink, brands have performed well. It's probably a better way of putting it, because essentially, like I mentioned before, consumers are falling back on trust. It comes back to this trust piece. So, retailers also, in terms of chilled ready meals, private label, they froze deals on it, and that was just to maintain availability. Because as we know, there was lots of empty shelves throughout the pandemic. Online is obviously another big winner out of COVID, and online, generally speaking, is more suited to brands. The e-commerce in general is more suited to brands than it is to private label. So that's another reason why the branded offering did well. And of course, neighborhood and convenience stores, they lean towards branded. So they've obviously far less private label offering than the big retail stores. And like I said, premium was positioned as a kind of an end of week celebratory treat. So I guess there's a couple of learnings really in 2021 and beyond. The sort of feeling in this article, in this report, is that those with a less processed feel, a healthier image will do well. Like we mentioned before, the health trend has accelerated during COVID anyway. So the brands that focus on this convenience and health will do well. And again, some of the companies that were quoted in the article are seeing, well, how can we navigate this new hybrid life that we're going to be living, of kind of working more from home and then going back into the office. So combining that scratch cooking trend, which seems to be sticky, people are not going to unlearn how to cook. If they sort of rediscovered cooking or learned how to cook in the first place, they're not going to unlearn that. So how can chilled ready meals and ready meals in general navigate that kind of new hybrid life of working from home and working in the office?
Brilliant article, and I was interested as well by some of the stats in Frozen, and the losers in Frozen being Slimming World and Weight Watchers, which I just thought was a really strong indicator of where maybe the UK public's been in terms of their headspace over the last period, in thinking, actually, I just want, as you say, something that feels nutritious, healthy, but I don't want to be on frozen slimming products at the moment, and I just want a meal that's going to suit my whole family, which was fascinating. And your point on trust and brands always brings me back to, unsurprisingly, the meat sector. And whenever you look at the meat sector, just the lack of brands that we've got when you walk down that meat, fish and poultry aisle in store, and even online, as you say, branded products sell so much better, and how the meat industry could be missing out there by not having more branded propositions to tell a story to. And maybe, hopefully, that's something more we'll see of this year.
Hopefully, indeed. Yeah, well, we're working on it, Laura, but I won't go into too much detail on that today. But
I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Julia, what's your second pick this week?
My second pick this week is from the FT, and it's an article titled "Lazy Britons Aren't the Reason for the UK's Migrant Workforce," and it's a piece written by Sarah O'Connor. This piece caught my eye because it's a recurring debate that keeps popping up every few months, really. I do remember commissioning an explainer article back, when I was on the Grocer, probably about 2 years ago. And again, sort of looking at some of the myths and misconceptions around seasonal workers. But it's an issue that I think keeps coming up time and time again, because that narrative, I think, about lazy Brits turning their noses up at fruit and veg picking jobs is just too easy and too tempting for some people. But Sarah O'Connor does a really great job explaining why that narrative is misguided. She looks at the Pick for Britain campaign that was launched last spring. Right when borders were closed, migrant workers couldn't travel into the country, and of course, lots of Brits suddenly found themselves furloughed. So, a great opportunity, it seemed, to get more Brits into fruit and veg picking jobs and reduce our reliance on migrant labour. Because, as the article points out, an estimated 99% of the UK's seasonal agricultural workers in the edible horticulture sector come from the EU. Now, in reality, getting more Brits into these jobs didn't quite work out. It really is a familiar pattern. There's a decent amount of interest initially, but few applicants then actually get placed, and even fewer then stick with those new jobs for any decent period of time. And this is largely, Sarah explains, because the work is hard, it's demanding, and it requires technical expertise and mental stamina. There is that perception that these are massively unskilled jobs, which is completely inaccurate. And I think people don't often appreciate the experience and technical expertise that's required to do these jobs well. Work is also irregular, so workers often live on site. And because our harvest seasons have expanded from, what used to be a sort of typical period of 6 weeks to now 6 to 8 months, these are jobs that now awkwardly fall between two stools. They are neither just a summer job for students, nor are they a permanent 12-month job suitable for people with families to support or rent to pay. And above all, it's about pay. And I thought Sarah really summed up this conundrum perfectly. She writes, Britons aren't lazy, they're rational. They will do tough or antisocial jobs if the pay compensates sufficiently, like working on an oil rig. But picking jobs don't pay a premium compared with working in a shop or cafe. Migrants are rational too. For them, UK farm work does pay a premium compared with the jobs at home. And when the premium shrinks, they stop coming. All of which means if the UK government really does want fewer migrant workers and more Brits in fields, and this isn't just a political slogan or a convenient narrative, then the pay and the condition needs to be higher, and it probably means higher prices in the shops, which the government, as we mentioned earlier, also doesn't want. No one wants to see higher feed prices. So in the end, says Sarah, it's about being more open and more honest about the trade-offs that are required. If the UK government says it wants to curb lower paid migration to create, she says, quote, high wage, high skill, high productivity economy, then it needs to level with people and with itself about what exactly that is going to involve. I don't know. I was fascinated to get your take on this and whether there is a similar sort of debate happening within Ireland about migrant workers and that sense of why can't we get more local people to do the job?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the previous point on the sort of interconnectedness and the globalized world that we live in. Like fundamentally, this is about supply and demand. Like it actually sort of it relates a little bit back to the previous article that we were talking about in terms of using the food that's in the UK or growing more of the food that's in the UK. And I guess there's always an economic reality, and unless the UK was to completely, or Ireland for that matter, or any country, was to completely shut its borders and be self-sufficient on everything, there is going to be trade flows. And whether those trade flows are beef or dairy or salmon or people, and labor as a service that's being provided. And I think in the article it was called out mainly from Bulgaria, Romania, and I can't remember the third country that was called out. But essentially, I mean, people from those countries are also picking fruit and vegetables in Ireland. And there was also an issue during COVID, the same issue in relation to that, because obviously there were restrictions on flights. So I think there's an appreciation that labor that people do fly in either for harvest season or for other perhaps lower paid, lower skilled jobs, and that there's an economic necessity in order to maintain the economy and a certain standard of living and a certain sort of like I said economy, that is a requirement, that that interconnectedness is important, and that, an openness to having people come into work, whether it's for a short period of time on certain jobs, is necessary.
Laura, what's your second pick for us?
My second pick this week is from the BBC, and it has the headline Pandemic Prompts Super Bowl Ad Rethink in US. So the NFL fans out there will know the Super Bowl is on the 7th of February, and the teams are, I'd had to look them up, I'm not going to lie, Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Kansas City Chiefs. And this is obviously an appointment to view, normally has viewing figures of 100 million in the US, and with the pandemic at the moment, probably anticipating even larger viewing figures as people are at home a little bit more than usual. But there's been a growing number of brands deciding not to advertise in the Super Bowl, and Budweiser have confirmed that they won't be either. And this is partly because, as we know, TV advertising is a tricky business, and you can't just decide the week before if you're going to take an advertising slot. So these decisions will have been made months and months out, probably in a time when not knowing where we're going to be with the global pandemic. So Bud are just one of the ones that have pulled out, but there's a general reasons that have been pulled out in the article. First of all, it's about finding the right message, and some of these big FMCGs are concerned that they won't be able to find the right message, particularly as production for these adverts as well, not only the advertising slots, but they would need to be filmed well in advance, and understanding where the pandemic would be at this stage, it would be really difficult. And also the financial crisis, the fact that over 10 million US citizens are out of work at the moment, to be really showy about a certain brand could be quite difficult. So parent company of Bud Anheuser-Busch have invested what they would normally do in the Super Bowl into an ad council campaign to promote vaccination in the States. And they've also pivoted, interestingly, I think, to an online 90-second commercial called Bud The Bigger Picture, which they've pushed out on their YouTube channels. Thinking about other players that would normally be in this space, Coca-Cola are also not advertising, and they didn't in 2019 either. And Hyundai, who would normally be a standard fixture in the advertising break, also aren't advertising, saying about their priorities have changed and vehicle launches have changed too, which I thought was fascinating. You don't really think of all this sequencing, but because of social distancing and the logistics and all the rest of it, it wouldn't probably neatly fit when a new model of vehicle was coming out, but it can't. Pepsi, they don't have an advert, but they are for the 10th year running advertising throughout the halftime show. Prize for if you know who the halftime show is. I had to Google it as well.
Oh yes, the halftime show. Usually they have someone like Beyonce on, or
Who is
like
it this year,
Madonna.
Donal?
Oh,
You
who's it
get a
this year?
prize. Yeah,
Oh, good one. Lady Gaga. No, she did the inauguration.
I know, she's too big.
Oh,
It's
she's
The
too big.
Weekend.
Oh, right, okay.
Which made me feel really old. Because I think, yeah, normally love them. That's worth staying up for. Not so much. Anyway, the 30-second advertising slot normally costs around just over $5 million during the championships, and the Super Bowl has a net advertising income of just over 450 million. So it's massive, obviously, to keep that sport, NFL, fueling, and to keep folks interested, and new innovations to come online. What the article did also call out is, even though some of these traditional players are coming out of advertising for the Super Bowl, there's some e-commerce players that are stepping up to the plate that you wouldn't normally see. And the one that really caught my eye was Fiverr, with the online freelancing platform. If you want to get a freelancer to voice something or to build your website or whatever, they're going into that Super Bowl space. So I just thought it was really fascinating that, has the pandemic, and you've used the words a couple of times, Donal, in tonight's chat about sticky. Do you think some of the changes for pandemic has naturally going to make some of these FMCG changes to the way that they promote their products, both the channels and the content, stick, and we're seeing a long-term change?
Absolutely. I was really interested by this one. I really liked your selection of this article. Well, at the beginning of the lockdown last year, it was a case of every FMCG or every company in general kind of released a statement, and it was all very kind of generic. Our first priority is to take care of the people we work with, and it was all very, like, a lot of those statements were just corporate. Like, you looked at your junk mail folder and you had 100 messages from companies who were saying that they're taking care of their people. Like, we kind of expect that. The companies that stood out were the ones who kind of did something that was kind of aligned to their brand. And what this actually reminded me of, I mean, that civic duty marketing is something that has worked well. And for some reason, what sprung to my mind when I read this one earlier was Bernie Sanders. Did you see the memes of Bernie
The
Sanders at the
mittens.
inauguration, sitting in the chair with his legs crossed and the kind of mitts on his hands? And so what they ended up doing, the Bernie Sanders campaign or the Bernie Sanders team, is they made T-shirts and crew neck jumpers, and they sold those jumpers, crew neck jumpers, and they gave the money to charity, to Meals on Wheels for Vermont, which is the state where I think he's a senator. I think it's senator. So, like, that's marketing that is on brand. It's to do with the pandemic, and it's civic duty marketing. So, like, similar to what Budweiser are doing here in relation to doing a vaccine education ad instead of, advertising beer during the Super Bowl, it's something that I think taps into the zeitgeist, if you want to use a German word, a zeitgeist of what people want or expect from brands that they trust and love, and it comes back to that idea of trust. So for some reason, that Super Bowl story reminded me of Bernie Sanders' T-shirts and crew neck jumper campaign.
Brilliant. I know, I'd love a pair of those mittens.
Yeah.
Donal, it's been lovely to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being our guest.
Oh, thanks. Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Yeah, delighted to participate. It was great.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you this week. Thank you so much for listening.
You can find links to the articles we discussed in the show notes at thepicklist.co.uk.
If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe, give it a rating and leave a review. It makes a massive difference to our podcast and helps us reach more people in the food industry who'd enjoy listening to The Pick List.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time.